This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver. Wisconsin Republicans are gearing up for their state political convention this weekend. J.R. Ross is here to explain why that's important this election year. He's editor of WisPolitics.com. Welcome, J.R. Thanks for being here. We've got an early edition Capital Notes this week.
No, thanks for having me.
All right, so the Republican National Convention is coming up. It'll be held in Milwaukee. A lot of people know about that. And that's getting a lot of attention locally. States also have conventions. The Wisconsin GOP's is coming up this weekend, and Wisconsin Democrats will hold theirs in the beginning of June. Starting off, what happens at a state convention?
Well, there are a couple of things to watch this week in the Republicans. One, they will go through the endorsement process in the U.S. Senate, which will be a formality, really. Eric Hovde is the only person who qualified. The party set a requirement that you had to raise $1 million from, I believe, some thousands of donors by end of March to qualify. Hovde's the only one who met that mark, so he'll be the only one eligible. Two, there will be a vote on the National Committee man and National Committee woman. Wisconsin has 3 members of the Republican National Committee. 2 are elected at convention every 2 years. A third is reserved for the state chair. It'll be interesting to watch those votes to see who gets in, 1, and 2, what direction the party is going. For example, in the National Committee woman race, you have a woman who's been, Mary Pat Kruger's been a long time Republican activist, kind of a traditional Republican in that sense, and that always been around the party, always been involved. Then you have the vice chair of the Dane County Republican Party running as kind of more of the Trumpier Turning Point USA type candidate. And there's an effort by Turning Point USA, which is this pro-Trump group, to try and get toeholds in parties around the country to take the National Committee in more of a Trumpy direction. So which direction do the state activists want to go? That's a big thing. And then thirdly, these are kind of rallies. They're trying to get the troops fired up ahead of what's going to be a long 5.5 months. There are going to be calls to make, yard signs to put out, doors to knock on. There's a chance for the activists to get together and kind of get that kind of pep rally going, raise their spirits for the fight ahead.
And how are Republicans going to divide their time this year? Is it more important for them, for instance, to push for the GOP presidential presumptive nominee Donald Trump's reelection, unseat U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, or perhaps hold on to state legislative seats because of redistricting? How are you hearing Republicans will spend their time and money with these competing priorities?
Oh, they're going to, convention is going to be a number of speeches. You'll hear from state lawmakers. You'll hear from members of the congressional delegation. You'll hear from Eric Hovde, the state party chair. So they're not really kind of hinting at their priorities this weekend. Everybody's going to see the table. The keynote speaker is a Trump surrogate, Byron Donalds, a congressman from Florida. So they're going to cover all their bases this weekend. And again, it's kind of a pep rally / messaging weekend, and they're looking for a positive message delivered through the media about what their vision is for the next couple to 4 years.
And there's a lot of talk about gaps in Wisconsin between urban and rural areas. How are Republicans this year at the convention, kind of balancing the strong support for Trump in rural areas with what's happening in the more urban areas?
It's not so much a convention question as an infrastructure question for them. Which I mean by that is opening offices, getting staffers on the ground. When Joe Biden was in town in the state last week, his campaign was talking about how he had, 44 offices opened in Wisconsin, 80 staffers on the ground between the campaign. It's called the Democratic Coordinating Campaign. Republicans aren't really there yet. They're still getting stuff organized. There's been a lot of shots taken at Republicans for closing, for example, a minority outreach office in Milwaukee. So really for Republicans, more about that. That's the bigger question, not convention, but how do they build that infrastructure, the resources to do it, and when do they get it in place? Because the Democrats have a head start, but when you look at the polls, it shows that Donald Trump has a bit of an edge over Joe Biden in Wisconsin, however slight it might be. But infrastructure helps you deliver results. It doesn't really change the trajectory of a race, but if it's a 50-50 race, whoever has the best infrastructure can sometimes pull out the win.
And you've reported at WisPolitics that there's the fundraising gap between state Republicans and the Wisconsin Democratic Party, which outraised at 15-1 in the first quarter of 2024. Is the convention one tool to turn that around?
Not really. More of those are kind of the responsibility of the state chair and the big wigs, essentially, of connecting and getting those big checks to come in. The state Democratic Party's done a better job of connecting with people willing to write big checks, especially from out of state. And there's been a push from some Republicans in the party to say, okay, we need to catch up. Yeah, we knock Democrats for going to California for cash, but there are Republican donors in California too, and Illinois and New York. We need to tap into those donors and try and boost our resources, because as one member argued in a memo a few weeks ago, they're falling behind. And without money, there's no infrastructure, there's no operation, no money, no message, or no mission. And there's going to be competition for dollars this year in Wisconsin among conservatives, because you have the national convention in town. They've got to raise money for that. Eric Hovey's raising money for a Senate race. You have kind of some intense contests for the legislature and the Assembly and the Senate. There's a lot of competition for in-state donors, and you run the risk, if you're the party, of going to people who are already tapped out, if you don't look at those out-of-state folks and try and bring more money in.
And does the state convention have a different sort of importance during a presidential election year like this?
A little bit. It's a little, there's a little bit of party business that's conducted, a little bit of kind of, seeing old friends, a little bit of a pep rally. So it is just a little more of a high-profile thing in election year because of what's at stake, 5 months later.
And you've, JR, covered these conventions in the past. What have you found to be the most illuminating or the most interesting?
Well, I'm kind of weird about conventions. I enjoy the debate about resolutions. These are like, the party activists have these debates that are very, very intense about very, very deeply personal issues that don't really matter a lot to the general public at large, but it tells you where the base is at sometimes. I've often said that of watching both parties, delegates, and activists have these debates, I realize that the political spectrum is not like a half circle, it's a smiley face, because at the end, the very extremes meet down below at the bottom. They have similar suspicions about the federal government, that kind of thing. So it's interesting to watch those. But really, for the party, they want to have this be a messaging thing. They want to try to highlight their best and deliver a message about how they're behind Donald Trump, they're behind Eric Hovey, they're going to fight to maintain control of the legislature and keep people like Derek Van Orden, 3rd Congressional District, who's being targeted, and Brian Stile in the 1st. So it's really about, again, message and juicing up the base and getting them going for the fall.
You're tuned in to Capitol Notes. I'm WWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Okay, so we'll turn the corner a second to let people know what's going on in the state legislature. The regular floor period where they take up new bills is done for the year. Legislators are focusing on their campaigns for re-election, but the state Senate met on Tuesday to take up veto overrides. First, before we get into what happened Tuesday, can you remind people what a veto override is and how they work in Wisconsin?
Sure. To override the governor's veto, you have to have a 2/3 vote of those present in both houses of the legislature. In the Senate, Republicans have a supermajority, 22-10 right now. In the Assembly, they don't. They're 2 votes short. So that means that Republicans, to override a veto of Governor Evers, would need to have all Republicans stay together and get 2 Democrats to support the override to be successful. No veto has been overridden since 1985. It's not a very common occurrence. And part of it is, it's hard to get bipartisan buy-in to an override. Typically, if you're a Republican and the governor's a Republican, you sustain his veto. And same for Democrats. If the person in the East Wing is a Dem and you're a Democratic lawmaker, you support his or her veto because it's party discipline and kind of expected of you.
So what happened on Tuesday was that the Senate sort of plowed through the 8 veto override votes largely without incident. But Republican leaders then rejected a move by Democrats to bring 5 assembly bills to the floor for votes, including one that would allow the processing of absentee ballots the day before an election. Can you tell us what's happening here?
Sure. So as they went through these veto overrides, Democrats wanted to make sure they had an opportunity for this motion to bring up 5 bills. They included things like making a Class C felony for a therapist to have sex with a client, property tax break for veterans, the early processing bill. They wanted to get votes on those because they thought they were important bills. 1 and 2, they also put some Republicans in an uncomfortable position because if you're voting against those things, they kind of up an ad sometimes because they can say, hey, this person's so extreme they opposed X, Y, and Z. So they proposed this motion on the floor. to bring up the votes, it was rejected. And then they went back to the overrides. And, Democrats weren't happy. They argued these are bipartisan bills, but it's rare, if ever, that I see the minority party succeed in trying to bring a bill up from committee or that it wasn't scheduled for the calendar for a vote on the floor.
So is there any hope for processing absentee ballots the day before the election for the 2024 election?
Miracles do happen, but I wouldn't count on that one in Wisconsin before this fall. There are several Republican lawmakers in the Senate who are opposed to it. And in talking to some of them, they've told me flat out that, look, people in some of these districts are convinced that there's something going amiss in Milwaukee with absentee ballots, that, these Democrats are up to no good. And their constituents believe falsely that if you can process these ballots the day before, you will actually start counting them, which would be barred of the bill. And then these clerks would tell local activists for Democrats, hey, you're short of your target number in Ward X or whatnot. And they'd go out there and try and get more people to vote, or there'd be some funny business. And they're unhappy about it. And so the Republicans have told me that it's not worth the grief they would get from constituents in their base back home to vote for that bill. So without a better argument or without convincing those folks of the need for it, it's not going to go anywhere, because Republicans do have that supermajority, but there are enough Republicans who are unhappy about the bill that they don't have 17 votes in the GOP caucus right now, as I can tell, to pass the bill. And while it would probably pass with all Democratic support and probably most of the Republicans typically have a rule that they stick by or guide that they want to have 17 votes from the GOP caucus alone to pass a bill. It basically guarantees that the majority is pushing that bill through, the majority party, without the help of the minority. When you start passing bills without 17 votes in the Republican caucus, it can cause you issues as a leader, because then some of your members aren't happy because they're not being heard. It's not a hard, fast rule, but it's been one that's been enforced more often than not in my time covering the state Senate.
Well, meanwhile, the city of Milwaukee has a central count for its election, which means that they take all these absentee ballots and they have to count them all in the same place, and they can't process them until the day of the election. And so people get upset that there's some sort of a quote-unquote ballot dump when they find that all these votes have been counted later on election night.
Yeah, that's what Donald Trump brought up in 2020. It was not a ballot dump. It just takes a while to count them. I remember in August of 2020 being up until, I think, like 3:30 a.m. awaiting the absentee ballot count for Milwaukee. I knew at that moment that I was going to end for a long night in November, because if they took until 3:30 counting ballots for primaries, when the turnout was much, much higher for the general election, it was going to be a long night into an early morning, and it was. But the argument from Republicans has become, well, they should just stop central count. It's not about the bill or processing, it's about doing it better, and they should do what Madison does, which Madison takes her absentee ballots and sends them out to the wards where voting is going on, and then the poll workers in those wards feed those ballots through the machines during the day. When times are slow, they'll go through those envelopes, open them up, process them, and pop them in the machine, have them counted. It works in Madison. Others argue that's a better process to have a central count in some communities, and that's what we have. And so without Milwaukee changing that process, which is not going to happen, it's going to be a late night, probably November, although I will point out we are not voting as heavily absentee as we used to. 3.3 million people voted in November of 2020. There were almost 2 million absentee ballots. We're not going to see that number again in 2024, barring something crazy happening. Turnout probably is not going to hit 3.3 million. People tell me because voters aren't excited about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump part two. And two, we're voting more normal, quote unquote normal. People are going to the polls again in higher numbers they did in 2020 without the pandemic going on. So we're not going to see that kind of a crush of absentee ballots in Milwaukee in 2024 that we saw in 2020 if expectations hold where we're at right now.
Yeah, that's good context to have. Okay, so thanks for that. As far as the drama that unfolded on Tuesday in the state Senate, you reported at WisPolitics that the Senate briefly descended into chaos after majority Republicans abruptly cut off debate on the overriding a veto of grants for hospitals in northwestern Wisconsin. Senate Minority Leader Dianne Hesselbein, a Democrat from Middleton, said it was, quote, the last gasp of a gerrymandered majority. What was happening there?
So they had gotten through the first 8 vetoes without too much of an incident. they went through the motion to bring the bills to the floor. And then on the ninth and final veto about the hospital grants, Senator Jesse James from Altoona, Republican, gave his speech about why he thought Evers was wrong. And immediately after his speech, Devin LeMahieu, the majority leader, moved to call the question, which basically means let's vote now. That is not something you usually do. Usually there's debate, and Democrats, the minority party, get time to offer their opinion. By cutting off the debate, it infuriated Democrats who objected. They went to the roll call as there's more objections were raised. Members like Tim Carpenter of Milwaukee, Jeff Smith of Brunswick, both Democrats, were yelling that they were unhappy about this. This was not appropriate. They were breaking the rules. Chris Capping, the Senate president from Delafield, was banging his gavel and calling Jeff Smith out of order. Smith fired back, "I don't care." At one point, Carpenter went to confront Devin LeMahieu in the back of the chamber about what was going on. They went up to the front of the room where Chris Capio was and got into it with him a little bit, how he's breaking the rules. Then immediately after they did the roll call on that, they moved to adjourn the session, which is supposed to be, if anybody objects, you don't do that motion. But Democrats were yelling, "I object." They closed it out anyway, and Carpenter flung his papers in the air about 12, 15 feet in Devin LeMahieu's direction. And that was it. That was the end, the inglorious end of the 2023-24 session in the state Senate. Tempers are obviously flared. Tensions are a little frayed in there, and they just got out of town. And I was told by Devin LeMahieu that they cut it off because a member had to catch a flight, and they needed to get done so he could go get on that flight.
All right. Well, and we're not in northwestern Wisconsin, so I'm not going to get into the whole issue of grants for hospitals there and what Evers did and what the legislators did. But if you're interested, go to wispolitics.com, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks for being our eyes and ears on the state capitol and on state politics, JR. And thanks for joining me on Capitol Notes.
Anytime.
That was J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com, speaking with me, WEWM's Maayan Silver. Listen for our segments every other Monday with an extended segment on Lake Effect, and check out the Capitol Notes podcast wherever you get your podcasts.